we're going to focus today on issues around putting your thesis together and lines of argument. So I think let's just introduce ourselves. If you wouldn't mind, if we just go around, if you can just say your name and whether you're doing a master's or a PhD, and just what stage you're at. So if you're working on the proposal, or if you've collected your data, or you're writing up, or wherever you are, and then that'll just help me to see where to pitch and how to include all of you. Okay, so we start with it.
Hi, my name is Jeremy. I'm doing a master's, and I'm hopefully writing up. I'm not sure most days, but I'm writing.
Yeah. Right. So you finished collecting your data and you're writing up.
Yeah.
Thanks.
My name is Zelda. I'm with my PhD. I'm now in chapter 5-6. Finished with all the data collected. Now I must write it up and make Postgraduates and put it in English.
Good. Thank you.
I'm Judith. I'm doing a PhD. I'm not collecting data, so I just have to write this to me. And I'm roughly at chapter 3-ish. But this is a problem.
Right. Okay. And so, are you doing something like a policy or conceptual?
Conceptual, yeah.
Okay. And is it in policy studies?
No, it went a bit out.
That's fine.
It's a bit of a slip. Challenge.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
Hi, I'm P Rule. I'm a primary school teacher doing my master's. Just finished with my data collection at the end of term 3 and busy with chapter 4.
Right. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hanley. I'm doing a master's in education, and I am still at the proposal stages, so I'm doing the defense in November. And I presented at the conference the last time around, and I had great feedback, so I would recommend all of you do it next year. It's an awesome experience.
Right. Thanks very much. And that's great. And it's good to hear about the conference. Any others who were at the conference?
There was the
I think we had about 17 Stellenbosch students who presented at this.
Yeah.
So it's a postgrad conference which gives you a chance to present your research, and you don't have to be finished your research. You could be at any stage. It just gives you a chance to present and get feedback. And it was at UWC.
Yeah. Let's see the next time around.
Yeah, so it rotates from across the Western Cape universities. We had it at Stellenbosch last year. So I really recommend that for next year. It's a really good chance to formulate your ideas, present it to your peers, and there's also academics who sit in or chair the sessions. And it just helps you to do that. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Lydia, but a different Lydia from yours, brother.
You my Lydia as well now.
Yes, I am. I'm doing my first year PhD in curriculum studies, still building the proposal, it's shaping up, hoping to defend it probably even not in the 2 weeks time, next year January.
Great, thanks very much.
For me?
Yeah.
So I'm typically a cricket one. Also doing my PhD in the curriculum studies. Submitted the proposal, been through the ethics clearance and through the institutional permission, all that tedious process, and I'm now supposed to be writing.
Thanks. Great.
Yes, good morning. My name is Lydia from Namibia. I'm also in the curriculum studies. I'm writing a proposal in workflow, so I'm based with parents and the outside members at home.
And then just doing a PhD as well.
I'm Ria Taylor. I'm doing a PhD. I'm in my final stage of finishing off Article 1. Already collected Article 2's data, and so
Okay.
it's peer dus het gesê ek moet net 'n paar dinge regmaak. I published the first article.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, so you're doing it by publication?
Yeah, by publication, and it's very hard work to do it by publication.
Yes. So that's an alternative route to a PhD.
Yes.
So that's good to know. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Madeleine Pedro, and I'm doing my master's in curriculum studies. And I collected my data last term, and so I'm starting with chapter 4 now.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much.
Morning, I'm Carmelita. My PhD is finished, but it's not awesome yet. So I'm working on quality control and making sure that all aspects are in place. So all goes well.
Thank you.
Morning, I'm McDonald. I'm just starting my PhD program.
I've just completed my proposal. We're still fighting about it. And I've already collected my data, so it's the other way around because I'm analyzing blocks. So yeah, it's clear.
You shouldn't have mentioned that. Thanks very much.
Fine-tune the proposal.
Good, excellent. Thank you. So we've got quite a range of people here. So from working on your proposal to having finished your PhD. So that's quite a range. But I think that this session will help all of you, because I think we're focusing on an argument which is really central to whatever stage you are. And I think that you'll be able to adapt it for your particular purposes. Okay. So I'm not too worried about diversity. In fact, I think that'll enrich our discussion. And I think we also have it's more like a workshop than an input session. So I'm going to give you a task that we'll do as we're going through the workshop, and you can apply it to your particular study. Okay. So let's just go through the program. Right, and we're going to be video recording the session. So Henny's just recording at the back there. So Henny, just let me know if there's problems with the audio or anything like that. Thank you. So we're going to start with talking a little bit about what is an argument, and then what are the lines of argument in a thesis. And so I'm going to focus on 5 lines of argument. The first one is around the rationale. Okay, so when you develop a rationale, in fact, you're developing an argument for your thesis, for why it's why you're doing it. And then we'll talk about the literature review and how the argument of the literature review, and then the methodology, how you develop an argument for your methodology and why it's appropriate for your thesis. And then the theoretical and conceptual framework and the thesis as a whole. Okay. And then we'll just conclude a little bit by talking about coherence and cohesion within the thesis as a whole. Okay, so that's what we want to do. We'll see how we go with time. We might finish a little bit earlier. And what I'm going to do is give you a worksheet, which I'll hand out now. And this is ready for you to think about each part of the argument and how it links to your particular study. So you'll be able to make some notes about ideas for the line of argument, and hopefully by the end of the session you'll have an idea of what your potential lines of argument are through the thesis and how you can link them. Right? So if we can achieve that, then I'll be very happy. Okay, so everybody got time? Right, so if we can just start off by talking about what is an argument. Okay, so typically we understand an argument in sort of ordinary language as a dispute between people. People get into an argument, and they often get quite emotional, perhaps shout at each other. So that's one meaning of argument, but we're not talking about that sense of argument. Okay, if you have a look, there's quite a few different meanings of the word argument. And if you have a look at the ones that I've highlighted there, number 3, argument as a process of reasoning or a series of reasons. And that's really what the key aspect of argument that we're looking at. And then also number 6, the central theme or the kind of the overall conclusion, you'd call that an argument. Okay. So in a way, if you talk about the thesis, if someone says to you, what is your thesis? You should be able to explain that in a couple of sentences, because you would present the overall argument saying, the thesis is an argument. Another word for thesis is argument. Okay. So we're going to focus on those 2 senses of argument. The one is a series of reasons, and the second one is the overall conclusion of your, what you found in your thesis. Does that make sense? Okay. So some of you will be working on the first one at different levels, because in your proposal, you're actually developing an argument for your particular study. Right. So you'll have been thinking about that. If you're working on your proposal, you'll be thinking about, why should I do this study? And you think about, how do I develop an argument to support my proposal? And that could come from the literature, from your own experience, and so on and so on. Okay, so we'll touch on that one, but also link it to the overall conclusion of your thesis if you are at that stage, or if you're working towards that stage. Okay, and all of these arguments are linked to each other. So that's why we talk about lines of argument, and I think that'll become clearer as we develop. Right. So is that first part okay? Are you happy with that? Because this is the basis of the whole day in a way. Right. So argument as a series of reasons. Right. That's the one sense. And then the second one as the overall theme or subject matter of your thesis. Okay. If you have a look on the sheet that I gave you, it's not on the PowerPoint, but you see there's also a definition of a thesis at the top there. You see a thesis has got those meanings. It can be a proposition stated or put forward for consideration. So in a way, that's where we're talking about the thesis as an argument. It's the proposition, the overall proposition that you're arguing for. Okay, and often you only work that out when you come to the end of the thesis. Okay. And then on the other hand, it's the subject for a composition, or it's the actual product. And usually we understand thesis as that big thing, that doorstop that you've got at the end. But another meaning is the actual proposition or argument that you've developed within that thesis. And in a way, that's more important. Right, so I'm just going to see if I can get into a short video. I don't know. Yeah. Perhaps you've seen this website. It's called Enhancing Postgraduate Environments. Have any of you used this website? this is really useful for postgrad students. It's developed by South African academics, and it's got a whole lot of resources that you can use for different stages of your thesis. So please make use of it. And I found one useful section on constructing an argument. I'm just going to play you a 5-minute or 4-minute video, which hopefully we'll be able to hear.
Thesis or technical publication. Your argument is a crucial part of your contribution to knowledge. This is an aspect of thesis writing that many students and postdoctoral researchers find challenging. So this project is designed to make the task of crafting and refining the argument of your thesis or paper a little less daunting. In essence, your argument is the main claim or point that your research wants to make in answer to a problem, question, or issue in your field. You locate this research problem, question, or issue as you read your way into your field and note certain knowledge gaps. Your study can make a particular kind of contribution, theoretical, empirical, methodological, depending on the gap and the problem or question you're most interested in addressing. You need to read widely to locate this gap and begin to form a possible responsible contribution. Argument crafting at postgraduate and postdoctoral level isn't an easy, linear, or one-off act. It takes time and is iterative. In this case, this means that your argument will develop and be refined as your research process unfolds. Each section of your paper or chapter of your thesis will make a part of your overall argument, so that you will have the sense of building over time, piece by piece, until you reach the conclusion. To help you get started on making clear to yourself and your supervisors or readers what your argument is, we are offering 2 practical tools that have similarities but work quite well when used together. There is a link to a worksheet underneath this video that you can download and complete to practice using these tools later on. Both tools draw on Stephen Toulmin's groundbreaking work on argumentation in the 1950s, which many different authors and teachers have used and adapted since. Tool 1 encourages you in concise prose to set out your claim, the reasons why you think that claim or argument needs to be made, and the evidence you will analyze or draw to support the claim in the paper or chapter. It can be used for a whole thesis, but it works better for smaller pieces of writing, such as a paper or a chapter. Tool 2 asks you to set up your claim and evidence supporting it, that adds a dimension of asking you to consider seriously counter-arguments and evidence that may contradict or challenge your claim. We can't pretend that those who disagree with our research don't exist. We need to acknowledge that there are different or other solutions to the problem we are interested in solving, but show how our proposed solution has value and makes a valid and novel contribution to knowledge in addition to, and sometimes in contradiction to, the existing counter-arguments. To make a strong, effective argument in a postgraduate thesis or publishable paper, you need to move from telling your readers what your argument is to showing them why your argument is sound and important. The example provided here on the screen hopefully indicates the difference. Think, in terms of your own research, how you would or could show your readers why your argument is important and how it contributes to knowledge and or practice in your field. Your argument is the golden thread that must pull through your whole thesis or paper, and it informs all the choices you will make as regards literature, theory, methodology, and analytical process. It drives the research forwards. Therefore, it is important to take time to work on articulating this aspect of your writing theory, and to keep it in mind throughout the research journey.
Okay, so that's just to start us off. So you get the idea there that argument is it's a process, right? So the idea of a journey, starting somewhere, developing it or building it up until you arrive at at the end of the journey. I was just struck by how the journey is from the village to the city. Did you notice that? I was wondering, I mean, maybe these days we should have an opposite type of journey. But anyway, I think that's, so the emphasis on the process and on the journey, that's really important. So you develop the argument bit by bit through the thesis until you come to the end. So it's not just suddenly your argument appears at the end. You've been building it up right through the different chapters. And I'll show you how we do that. And then did you notice that there was also an emphasis on not just telling, but showing? Did that make sense to you? How did you understand that distinction between argument as telling and argument as showing? Can anyone give us a sense of, how do you understand that difference? Yeah?
Well, maybe in your literature review, you will be showing different sides of an argument without explicitly linking it to your own argument, but all those contributions will help enlighten your argument eventually in later chapters as well.
Yes. Good. Okay. So one of the ways of showing your argument is drawing on relevant literature to support the argument. So showing is about using appropriate evidence to back up your argument. Right. And so literature could be one kind of evidence. And so you'd use literature, for example, to show where the gap in the scholarship is. You'll say people have done this and this and this, but they haven't done that. And that's part of the argument in your literature review. And then even when you're presenting your findings, you might connect that to the literature, which would be a way of showing as well as telling. So what other kinds of evidence would you use besides the literature? That's right, exactly, the data. So the empirical data that you're gathering, so it could be from interviews, focus groups, observations, document analysis. That would also be a way of showing. So showing is about backing up your propositions, but with appropriate evidence. So I think that's what we mean by showing as well as telling. If you're just telling, then it's not convincing. You have to show that it's grounded in appropriate examples and reasons as you build your argument. Right. Okay. And then did you also notice how he was emphasizing that the argument is related to the research question or problem? Okay. So in a way, the argument is your response to that question or problem. So the research problem and the question that's linked to that is at the center of the thesis, and then your response to that problem is the main argument of the thesis. Okay. So that's you work around that, and I'll show you as we're going along how we get there. So in a way, right through as you're doing your thesis, you have to have your research problem, your main question in mind right through the process, so that you're thinking about how am I developing my argument in response to this central problem or question. Okay. Good. So that's just to give us an overall perspective around argument. And then let's move on and have a look. Here's an example of an argument. The thesis argues that becoming a learning organization can contribute to the sustainability of small IT companies. Okay, so there's a statement of an argument. You see how it's linking different things there. An argument is, so it's linking a learning organization, and it's linking sustainability of IT companies, and showing that if you do this, then it leads to that. So that an argument typically links two or more factors in some kind of relationship. Okay, and then the thesis would present evidence to back up the argument. So if you have a look, an argument is, the thesis is the argument supported by reasons or evidence. Okay. So the thesis argues that becoming a learning organization can contribute to the sustainability of small IT companies because, and then here comes the evidence, right? Team learning, personal mastery, and systems thinking increase innovation and flexibility. And then you'd have to have evidence to show that, from your interviews and observation and so on, to show that that is the case. Okay. Right, you'll have a chance to practice this as we're going along. Right, so there are the 5 lines of argument. The first one is the rationale, which is justifying your topic. Sometimes it's called a motivation, and that would appear in your chapter 1 or in your proposal. Right, so in your proposal, you have to motivate for why it's worth doing your study, and that's probably the first line of argument. The second one would be the literature, so situating your study in the scholarship, showing how your argument fits in with the literature, either that it's addressing a gap in the literature, or that it's building on the literature in some way, or that it's modifying or extending the literature. And then the third aspect is theory, justifying your theoretical approach. So you need to make an argument for why your theoretical framework or your conceptual framework is appropriate for your particular study. Okay. And then the fourth, the methodology, justifying your methodological approach. Why are you choosing this particular methodology? Why is this methodology appropriate for your study and not another methodology? Okay. So what are the reasons that you can present for that? And then finally, the thesis, presenting an argument for the significance of the findings. And so that's the final statement or your final answer to the question that you started with. Now I think that why argument is important and difficult is because sometimes we present all of these things without developing the argument for them. Right. So you have a literature review, and the literature review looks at the different relevant literature. But in addition to that, you have to tie that into your topic and show how your topic relates to that literature. What gap are you addressing? Are you building? Are you critiquing the literature? Are you showing something that's not there? Or are you extending it? What is the kind of argument you're making about the literature? Right. Yes? Yeah.
I'm doing the articles. Every article has
yes.
lines of argument.
Okay. Yeah, every argument would have an argument. Every article would have an argument, but there might be different kinds of argument within the article. Okay.
Every article is a different argument, question, research question.
Yes. So you've got an article on different research questions.
Yes, I've got a big, is it formula?
Okay.
And then 3 sub-questions.
Okay, right.
And then every article is about one to get to the big one.
Okay, good. Yeah, so then every article would be presenting an answer to that question, that particular question, and then giving reasons and examples and data to back up that particular answer and to link it to the bigger question. Okay, so that would be linked to this number 5.
So number 5 is the overall what you're going to put it into one thesis.
Yeah. But it's quite likely that your different articles would also have other arguments in them. Okay, so you might include a literature review as part of the article.
Yes, in every article a literature review.
Okay, and there might be a methodology section.
Yes, and then everything is linked to the big question.
Yes, that's right, and I'll show you how it fits in. But when you're writing an article, you also are developing arguments for those different things, depending on the focus of the article. So you'd be saying, this is the literature, this is how the literature relates to my topic, and this is my argument about the literature, right? That I'm addressing a gap, that I'm extending it, and so on and so on. The same with the methodology, the theoretical framework, depending on the focus of the article. Okay. So it's good to think about and to ask yourself, what is my argument in this article or in this chapter? And sometimes students don't do that. They just present the methodology without thinking about what is my argument for the methodology. Right. So that's what I'm focusing on today. Eh? And it's almost like it's a higher order skill that you have to develop as a postgraduate student. Not just being able to master the literature and understand it, but be able to link it and use it in an argument. And that's what we're looking for. Yeah. Yes.
So if I'm using, in my first article, I'm using document analysis. So I must argue why I'm using the document analysis and not.
Exactly. So that would be your methodological argument. That would be number 4 there. Okay. And then if you're presenting a particular theoretical framework or lens to analyze the data, then you need to have an argument for why that theory is appropriate for your particular purposes. Okay. And is that okay so far? Can we carry on? Right. So let's start by having a look. You see, there's a diagrammatic presentation of how the different lines of argument link to each other. So those arguments, the rationale, literature review, methodology, and theory, are all backing up that central argument around the findings. Okay, so they're all supporting it cumulatively through the thesis. Let's start with the rationale. The rationale, sometimes also called a motivation or a justification, is what you do to show why your topic is important and worth doing. Right. And the possible lines of argument could be that the issue is important. I'm looking at this particular topic because it's a very important current issue in South Africa. That could be one kind of argument. It could be that there's a particular gap in the scholarship. So I'm looking at this particular issue because other scholars have not looked at it. Hi, welcome. Scholars have looked at this and this and this, but not that. So there's the gap. Or it could be that your own interest and experience is relevant. Right? I'm looking at this topic because I have 20 years of experience working in this particular area, and therefore, I'm qualified to investigate it, and I'm interested in it. So you could have these different kinds of arguments to justify your topic. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Experience. So you have to tell them what are you doing, and also you have to tell the experience that you did. Bijvoorbeeld, ik heb school gebruikt en my stuk maar even specifiek dan kan zien.
It depends on the topic. So it depends whether your experience is particularly relevant. So I wouldn't say you always have to do that, but if your experience and interests are relevant, then it's a good idea to mention it. Right? So you might say, I've worked for 20 years with foundation phase children, and I've found that reading is a recurring problem in the foundation phase, and it's often linked to parental interaction, something like that. Okay. So my own experience shows that, therefore, that could be part of the line of argument for your rationale. Not the only one. Right. So it depends on the topic. But I'm just saying these are 3 possible lines of argument. I'd say that the scholarship, you'd have to include that. Right? You'd have to have some reference to the literature or the scholarship. Not necessarily that there's a gap, but that no one's looked at it. But you need to relate your study to the literature and show what the relation is and why it's worth doing, what contribution it can make to scholarship. Okay. So are you thinking about your own rationale now? Okay. Yes?
It's sufficient to use one form of rationale, but it's stronger to maybe use all four.
Yeah. Again, I can't say, I can't give a general answer to that question because I think it depends on your topic. I'd say you need to make an argument about what kind of contribution it can make to the scholarship. That would be, for any study, that you have to include that argument. Right. And then the other ones, it would depend whether they're appropriate for your particular topic and for your particular positionality. And I'll show you an example. Okay. Here's one of my former master's students who was interested in looking at students with hidden disabilities in higher education. So by hidden disabilities, it would be disabilities that are not visible to other people. And particularly, she was interested in chronic illnesses. So people who are living with chronic illnesses, no one can see, but it affects their studies. So let's have a look at what she said. As someone who has lived with chronic illness whilst trying to further my education, I've often felt alone, disbelieved, misunderstood, disheartened, and frustrated. Their story is my story, and it's a story that needs to be told. Despite, and then she quotes, despite a growth of interest in widening access and participation and in inclusive higher education, the voices of disabled students themselves have hardly been heard. Right. By exploring these students' storied lives, one can gain a better understanding of the functioning and needs of this under-researched group. This may have important implications for how universities will gain access to and help these students in the future. Okay. So just have a look at that rationale. What I'd like you to do is just talk about it to a person sitting next to you or behind you for a couple of minutes. What kinds of arguments do you see there in that rationale? Okay, so I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to chat about that, and then let's talk about it together. Had a chance to talk about that? What kinds of argument do you notice in that rationale? Yes, Sim?
We're saying actually 3.
Okay, tell us about them.
We say, first of all, she's actually raising quite an important question.
Okay.
In terms of higher education, reforming the universities.
Okay, so she's saying it's an important issue, eh? And where did you see that?
Well, the way it says that despite of the growth of interest in widening access and participation, so the institutions of higher learning have actually widened the access.
Okay.
But there is a but there.
Yes.
And it says that participation and inclusive higher education, the voices of disabled students themselves have hardly been heard.
Okay.
So that statement,
yes.
Quite so I think also actually it shows the problem. It also even shows the gap in terms of literature as well.
Okay, good.
Because even in the literature, the literature has looked at this,
yes.
But it hasn't looked at this.
Okay, yeah. Good. Right, so she's saying that the issue is important, and I think it is signaled in that quotation, but also in the last paragraph there. You notice she says, this may have important implications for how universities will gain access to and help these students. Right, so the issues around access and participation is an important issue in universities. So that's the one kind of argument. And then, as you're saying, the second argument is that the scholarship hasn't looked at this sufficiently. Especially, it hasn't included the voices of persons with disabilities. Right. So that's another important part of the argument around the literature. And then, any other argument that you saw there?
The first one is
her own experience, eh? Right. So you can see that in this particular study, her own experience is very relevant because she's someone who's lived with a chronic illness, and therefore the topic is she has direct experience of this topic. Right? But that wouldn't be the case in every study. So you have to work out whether or not your own experience is relevant to bring into the study. Okay. Yes, yeah.
Language.
Yes.
She's telling a story about herself, and then she linked it to a quotation to say something. But mustn't there be words to say that this is also a story what I said about my own, just to link the argument more, that you use the words to link argument to your story. Because she only gave a quotation, she gave a Fuller and that, but she didn't say that Fuller and this also argue the same as.
Yeah, I was condensing it a bit just for example.
Also the under-researched group.
Yes.
it's just a statement. There's no literature to say that she really looked at the under-researched group and that this and this and this also, I studied this and out of this find.
Yes. Good. Yeah, no, I think those are valuable, that's a valuable analysis. Okay, so you're thinking about how you develop and justify the argument. Yeah.
About the articles. And what is a peer Engels? Somebody
reviewer?
That readers, because they read your articles and they
A reviewer.
and the reviewers.
Yes.
And I have lots of questions about
Yes.
when you don't link every
Yes.
argument
Yes.
properly.
Absolutely.
And I think we must really think about that because every sentence you must really think about linking,
Yes.
get the argument flowing.
Yes. No, that's great, and thank you for that. So I was just taking a few extracts from her argument.
When you look at
Yeah.
examples like that, we go right like that, and that's what the problem is.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes.
So this is going to go into chapter 1, right? And the rationale, you do this quite early on.
Yes. Yeah. So it would be in chapter 1. Yeah.
And then, so she's going to look at students, or but she hasn't defined that sample.
Yeah. I mean, she did define it elsewhere. Yeah.
I find that quite difficult.
Yes.
Because you immediately need to talk. You need to build your arguments about the people that you haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, it's what comes first, and it is a challenge in chapter 1 to work out what information to include where. Okay, so you might include some of that information earlier on in your chapter where you talk about the focus of the study, and you might say I'm focusing on this particular issue with these particular people. Okay, but yeah, I agree. Right. So.
One lost.
Sorry?
Mustn't you do chapter 1 last?
Yeah, usually the chapter 1 is an elaboration of your proposal. Okay, so this would appear in the proposal, and then you would use that as a basis for your chapter 1. But people often do write chapter 1 once they've, at the end of the thing. Okay, because in a way, the proposal's done a lot of that work. Okay, so the main point is that I wanted you to see the kinds of argument. Okay, I agree with the stuff you've said about the cohesion, and we have to attend to that. But so those are some of the kinds of arguments you can develop. Okay, and if you have a look on your sheet there, on the second page, you see there's just a summary there. So it says the focus of rationale is justifying your topic. The type of argument, why your study is important and worth doing, and where it appears would be in the proposal and chapter 1 as part of your rationale or motivation. And then the kinds of support, as I was saying, contextual significance, gap in scholarship, personal engagement and interest. And you need to link it again to the whole. My study is significant and worth pursuing because that kind of statement. So what I'd like you to do now is, if you have a look at your worksheet there, I'd like you just to, and you might have been doing it already, just to fill in some ideas for your own study in that first row there. Right, so I'll just give you a couple of minutes to think about that and jot down some ideas. And then once you've done that, you can just talk to your partner about what kind of rationale are you going to use for your particular study. Right. Have you all had a chance to chat? Have you all three of you had a chance? You didn't have a chance? How many of you had a chance? Did two of you or just one of you? Okay, who didn't have a chance there? Tracy, have you developed a topic? You're working on it. Okay, so you're thinking about the rationale. And other groups, you had a chance to share both sides to share. Okay, good. Right. So I hope that that's helped you a bit to articulate your reasons for doing the study. Okay? Right. So that's really the motivational rationale is the reasons for why the study is important. That's the one part of it, and then the second part is you showing the examiners or the reviewers why you can do it in a way. Right, so that's also part of it. By giving good reasons for your study, right? And those might be reasons around the scholarship, reasons around the importance of the issue, and or reasons about your own particular experience and expertise. Okay. And the combination of those things will vary according to your particular topic and your particular experience, right? But for any rationale, you'd have to make an argument around the relation to the scholarship. Okay, so that's important. And we're coming on to that now, because there's a little bit of an overlap between your rationale and the argument linked to the literature review. Okay, so that's what we're going to have a look now. The second part is the argument in relation to the literature review. So I think we have had workshops around literature review previously. It's about situating your study in the scholarship, how your study fits into and contributes to existing scholarship. So the possible lines of argument could be, my study builds on existing literature. Right. So you might say, people have looked at this topic. I'm going to look at it again, perhaps in a different context or at a different level. Right, so that would be building on what's been done previously. You could take a topic from the literature, but address it from a different perspective or in a different way. Right, so you might say, people have looked at this topic, but they've looked at it more from a quantitative perspective. Right, now I'm going to look at it qualitatively. Or you might say, people have looked at it, have surveyed the topic, but there haven't been case studies on the topic. So you might say you're bringing in a different methodological perspective. Or it might be a different contextual perspective. Or you might say, my study addresses a gap in the literature and breaks new ground. In other words, people haven't looked at this before. Right. So you have to know the literature really well in order to be able to construct an argument that addresses, that situates your study in relation to the literature. If you don't know the literature well, you can't make that argument. Okay, that's why it's really important to have a thorough knowledge of relevant literature in your particular area. Okay. Right, so now you're all thinking about what is my particular argument in relation to the literature, which is great. Okay. Let's have a look at one example of that. So here it's the same study. My student who was looking at hidden disabilities. Let's see what she says. So she says, what are the experiences and challenges faced by adult learners with hidden disabilities in the higher education context? So you see she's starting with a research question or a research problem. Eh? And then she's thinking about it. Now, how does the literature link to this particular problem? This question has not been explored in much detail. There's a small body of research that focuses particularly on chronic illness as a hidden disability within a higher education context, but it does not concentrate on adult learners in particular. There is research on adult learners in higher education, disabled learners in higher education, disabled adult learners in other educational contexts, and people with hidden disabilities both within and outside the education arena. But very little research has combined all of these variables as one area of focus, or within a South African context. A more in-depth analysis of the above research will follow. Okay, so do you see how she's working out where she fits in the literature? This is what's there. She says, this is what there is, but I'm looking at this particular area, and the literature hasn't really combined those things. So that's what I'm adding in to the literature. But you can't do that unless you know the literature well. Okay. So doing a review of the literature is really important. Having good knowledge of the literature is really important. But there's another step, and that is situating your study in relation to that literature and developing an argument for your study. Okay. Right. So the kinds of gaps in the literature, there could be a substantive gap
And that is that the topic has not been covered before. By substantive, I mean the content, the actual content of it. So people haven't looked at hidden disabilities in South African universities. That would be the actual content. There could be a conceptual or theoretical gap. Right. So people haven't used this particular theoretical lens to look at the issue. So the issue has been covered, but no one has brought in this lens around, for example, maybe experiential learning. They've used cognitive theories of learning, but not experiential learning, for example. Okay, so that would be more like a conceptual or theoretical gap. There could also be a methodological gap. Right. So, for example, a while ago, when AIDS research in South Africa was mainly quantitative, people had done surveys and looked at statistics, but there was very little qualitative research of finding out about the lived experiences of people living with AIDS. So that was a gap that was identified, and then people started to do studies like narrative studies or case studies where they focused on people's lived experience. Okay, so that would be like a methodological gap. And then there could be a contextual gap, that people have done this research, but they've done it in other countries or other places. No one's looked at it here in South Africa or in the Western Cape or in Africa. So the gap might be one or a combination of those kinds of gaps in the literature. Substantive, conceptual, methodological, and or contextual. Right. Okay, so I'm going to give you a bit of a chance again to write there your ideas around what is your argument around how your study fits into and contributes to existing literature. See if you can write a sentence or two in that space there to summarize your argument regarding your study in relation to the literature. Okay. So I think you had a chance to write down a few ideas. Discuss that with your partner. What is your argument regarding the relation of your study to the existing scholarship? That's what I'd like you to discuss. I'm going to stop you there. I think you've all had a chance to talk a little bit about the argument from the literature. If I can just ask, do you feel clearer now about your argument regarding literature? Okay. Are there any questions or comments people would like to raise coming out of that discussion? Yeah.
I'd just like to know, would this be something that you would mention in your introduction to your literature review? The type of argument you identify with, and then whenever you see that in your literature that argument comes through, that you try to then also highlight it, or how would you present throughout your literature study? How would you kind of create that?
Yes.
My question links is that
sure.
we're sort of simplifying it here, and we had to get in a little block.
Absolutely.
But then you have to write 20 to 40 pages.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think it's linking to what you say.
Yeah. So in a way, it's a bit oversimplistic. But I think one of the advantages of trying to formulate it briefly is you have to crystallize the argument. Okay. So that is a useful thing. Sorry, can I just answer? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
That's exactly
yes.
The point. Is I think, I couldn't really do it. I can waffle all around the point. But what I actually realized is what you have shown today, even though I'm not there, is I'm definitely a teller and not a shower. I can bring you everything, but I can't necessarily crystallize it in a very strong way. I just want to I think I'm showing, but I'm actually telling you.
Okay.
This is it, can't you see it? It's obvious. But I'm not getting to the obvious. I'm sort of expecting the reader to read through all of this and get to the obvious, because it is clearly obvious, but it's not obvious at all because I couldn't even structure it obvious. So I think the thing about going small here is actually showing that I can't show because I can't even crystallize it.
Okay. Good.
I just mean that, I found that I have quite a long literature review. I think I will maybe still shorten it a bit, but it's almost 80 pages long.
Wow.
And,
Okay.
and I think, like, what I found is it can become quite redundant if you throughout, mention the whole time. Like, for example, and this is, clearly a gap. When do you need to thread that argument, and when is it just sufficient to give the I just need a little.
Okay, good. Thank you. I think it's a really important question, and I think that there are different ways of doing it. Right. So one way of doing it would be in your introduction to say, in this chapter, I argue that. So you can formulate the argument up front, and then just in one or two sentences, you'd say, I argue that there's a particular gap in the literature in this or that aspect, and then I will show that through my literature review, right? And then you, as you're going through the literature, you link back to that argument in that way. Okay. And then that might also help you to decide what to include and what to leave out if you're having problems with length, because you can say, how is this section strengthening my argument? What is the most important aspects in relation to my line of argument? If you already made the point, you don't need necessarily to keep on making the point. Okay, and then you can choose the most pertinent literature that shows that point. Okay, and then you can summarize the rest of it by just perhaps condensing it or synthesizing it. Okay, you don't have to go exhaustively into every article that you've read. You can summarize and synthesize, and that might be a way of dealing with that problem. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. You state the argument up front. Another way of doing it would be to build the argument and then state it at the end. Okay, and that would be more like an inductive approach to it, where you're pulling, you're developing the threads and then tying them up at the end. Or you could do both. You could state the argument up front, build it, and then summarize it at the end. Okay. But it's a good idea to see if you can formulate it. In this chapter, I argue that. And then you can work out where you're going to put that and how you're going to build it. Yeah?
Isn't it good to put it in topics? You first do the gap, then you do this, and then you do that, and summarize at the end. Because then you work with structure.
Yes.
Because it's very important that you link the language the whole time. And the whole time you have to state what is the facts and to get it at one whole.
Yes. I think using themes or topics or as your headings is a good strategy. Yeah, no. In fact, I think I wouldn't take it out, because I think that having thematic headings helps you to structure your literature review. Because I think, as you're saying, you can get a bit lost in the literature. It can be a bit overwhelming. So the more structure you can bring, the better, I think. And so one kind of structure is the argument structure. Another would be the thematic headings that you're using. Don't make your literature review too long, because if it's going to be, say, 80 pages, I would say that's too long, and you can actually cut it down, and that would probably strengthen the argument. If it's too long, you start to dilute the argument and lose the focus. Right, so think about that as well. Okay, it's a skill to condense the argument. It's a real academic skill. If you look at an article, often there's only 2 or 3 paragraphs on literature, maybe 1 or 2 pages, and that's because the writers have condensed all of that stuff and decided what's most important, and then but the argument is clear, and the way that they show that they've engaged with the literature is by synthesizing and summarizing. So summarizing would be saying briefly. Synthesizing would be bringing together the different kinds of literature. And you know how you do that. You just put in brackets a whole lot of references, and then you have a sentence which condenses the main line of, the main themes or content of that literature. So think about those moves: summary, synthesis, evaluation, and then relation to your study. Those are the kind of moves you'd be making in the literature review. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Any other questions about literature review or comments? Sim?
Ask about the methodology.
Yes.
Because I'm sort of doing the design-based research.
Okay.
Does that fit there? And I'm just trying to think in my head, how does it actually work in terms of that?
Yes. Now, usually the methodology the methodology chapter would also include a review of literature, but of the methodological literature. Okay. So literature review is not confined to your chapter 2 or whatever it is. It should run through a number of chapters, depending on what's relevant to that particular chapter. So in the methodology chapter, and we'll talk about that, you do make an argument for your methodology in relation to the methodological literature. Okay, and I'll show you an example of that. Okay, good. Can we carry on? Right. So let's look at one additional line, which would be the theory, and then we'll have a tea break. Let me just get that back. Right, so the third line of argument would be in relation to your theoretical approach. And here you'd need to argue why your theoretical or conceptual framework is appropriate to your study. Okay. Again, you're not just telling the reader what theory you're using, but you're showing why it's appropriate for your particular study. Okay, why this theory and not other theory? The possible lines of argument could be that the theory and concepts have been used in similar studies. Okay. So as you're looking at the literature, you often see that people use particular theories or ideas in relation to that topic. Okay. So for example, in mathematics, often constructivism might be used. If you're looking at, say, adult education, transformative learning theory is often used to talk about adults learning. So you'll see that there's certain pet theories that are often used in relation to your particular topic. So that could be one argument. People have used this theory for this topic, therefore I'm using it. Another line of argument could be the theory or concept shed new light on the topic. So that's almost like the opposite line. People haven't used this theory, but it can give us new insights which people haven't considered before. Right. So that's also a possible line of argument. The theory and concepts help me to understand the study in a useful way, or theory and the concepts help to analyze and interpret the data in illuminating ways. Right, so those could be other lines of argument. So you could use one or more of those lines of argument in your particular study, or you might have other ideas of lines of argument. Okay. The theory has to be relevant to your study, obviously. So you have to think about what is the particular relation, how's this theory or these concepts going to help me with my study. It's not enough just to present the theory. You have to link it and argue about its relevance and appropriateness for your particular study. Right. So that's the key thing, and that's not easy to do. Okay. You might just use one theory, or you might use a few theories, or you might use particular concepts. Right. So a concept would be an idea that's part of a bigger theory. So if you're just using particular ideas, then you're more likely to develop a conceptual framework if you're using one theory and the ideas within that theory, then it's more likely to be a theoretical framework. Okay. So you need to work out what kind of framework. Some people decide that they're not going to start with a theory, and they adopt what is called a grounded theory approach. Have you heard of that? Okay. So that's where you develop the theory from the data. And so that would be more like an inductive approach, and you end up with a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework that comes out of the data. But even if you do that, you need to justify that approach. So that's usually called grounded theory approach. Okay. So whatever theory you do or don't use, you need to have some sort of theoretical reflection which presents an argument regarding theory. Okay. So again, this will depend very much on your particular study. So I'm going to give you a chance now just to put down your ideas about that. Why is your theoretical conceptual framework appropriate for your study? So I think it's useful just to start by jotting down what are the key theories you're using or the key ideas, and then see if you can formulate a sentence or two about why is that appropriate for your study. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to do that, then we'll talk about that together. I think you've had a chance now to talk about the theory, and this is a bit tricky, because it's quite different. It's difficult to separate the theory from the literature sometimes. And I've had a few questions around: do you put it in the same chapter? Do you have separate chapters? That's again, there's different possibilities there. You might have a chapter on your literature review, which combines a review of relevant theory, and you might end the chapter with some kind of theoretical framework or conceptual framework. So you can integrate the theory with the literature review, but you can also separate them into separate chapters. So you might first have a review of literature and look at what people have found out about your topic. So that would be the focus on empirical. By empirical, I mean, what have people actually gone out and seen about your topic, and what are the findings in relation to the topic. And then you might have a separate chapter which looks at the theory. What are the theories that are appropriate for your particular study? And those theories might come out of the literature. But then you need to explain what those theories are and why they are appropriate for your study and how they relate to your study and to each other. So that could be a separate chapter which you could call a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework. Okay. And there's no one answer to that. I think it depends on your particular study and also your own, what you feel comfortable with in how you do it. Okay. So, Carmelita, you've finished writing your thesis now. Did you have a separate chapter on theory, or did you integrate it with your literature review?
I integrated it with my literature.
Okay.
So it was, like you said, first what does literature say about my topic?
Yes.
And then what theories are going to help me to answer my research question?
Yes. Okay.
Or what theories are going to illuminate what I'm trying to find?
Okay, exactly. So you kind of developed that from the literature review, but you had it as part of the same chapter. Okay, right. So that's one way of doing it. So in that chapter, you would have two lines of argument in a way. The one would be, this is how my study fits into the literature, and you present an argument for that. Then another one would be, this is the theory that's appropriate for my literature. Okay, sorry, for my study. This is the theory from the literature that's appropriate for my study, which will illuminate my study and so on. So the lines of argument, you might have two lines of argument in the same chapter, or you might separate them and have them. And it's up to you to decide what's appropriate. Someone else had a hand? Yes.
So for instance, I don't have data.
Sure.
So it's a conceptual
yes.
chapter.
Yeah.
So But is it possible then, obviously, so it's situated within democratic citizenship
Okay.
education, so
Yes.
that it sits within that.
Yes.
So is it possible then to have, say, two or three or four chapters that actually deals with specific concepts within, you know, what does democracy mean?
Yes.
What does democratic citizenship mean? And what is teaching and learning pedagogy?
Yes.
Practices within that. So is it impossible to not necessarily have the teacher with only the theory, but to have the teacher and discussion of the concept,
Yes.
building up very slowly to eventually get to, you know, applying that to specific, so in my case, CA education, to build it up to CA education.
Yes.
So, but that could work as well.
Yes, absolutely,
I'm not
yeah.
arguing for the theory or saying I'm using a specific theory, but I'm debating the concepts
Yes.
in my frame. which
That's right.
is citizenship.
Yes, I think that would be entirely appropriate. So, because your study is a more like a conceptual study, you'd spend a lot of time explaining and discussing the key concepts, and then you'd perhaps apply them to a particular document or whatever it is later on. Yeah, I had a student who did something similar. I mean, she was looking at social movements and ideas around hegemony in social movements in South Africa. And so she had about 4 or 5 conceptual chapters, which was a bit exhausting, but that fits it in well with her study. Okay, so you have to work out what is the kind of scale of theory in your study, and how is it best to develop that theory or concepts in your study. Yes.
I'm sure about that. So I am also planning on it. Chapter 5 is the conceptual blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And then it's chapter 6 suddenly it turns, well, I'm changing. I'm now in chapter 3 and I'm thinking I should change, but I'm not 100% sure. So the plan was in chapter 6 now suddenly I say, okay, but all of this I want to discuss with regards to how we train CAs in South Africa. But even though I'm not, 2, 3, 4, 5 actually has nothing to do with CA education, but should I start just mentioning in those early chapters where I discuss the concept that we will get to a specific field in chapter 6?
Yes.
Because otherwise it might be like a bit of a shock to a reader when you get to chapter 6, even though I don't want to bring the concepts in.
Yes.
2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
But 2, 3, 4, 5 is only going to make sense because in 6 I'm going to discuss something. But should I start saying should I start looking forward without discussing it?
Yeah, I think it's useful to make those links. And I mean, chapter 1 will set up the whole thing. Yes, but I think in each chapter it is useful to say what the purpose of the chapter is in relation to the topic. So then you're making that connection, usually in the introduction to the chapter. But sometimes you can reinforce that as you're proceeding through the chapter, and then again in the conclusion, connect it with the overall topic and link it to the chapters that come before and after. Right, and that's part of building the thread of your argument and pulling that through the various chapters. Okay. Right, I think it's time for a tea break. Let's have a. Can we have a say? I think we're all here, so it's a couple of minutes before I said. But are you okay if we start?
Before we start,
Yeah, sure, Lydia.
how do we get this slides? This video, the recordings.
Henny, can you?
By upload it onto the YouTube channel, we will just tell you which channel. I'm not sure yet.
Okay, right. So, but
The previous ones are uploaded already.
okay, I think they're on the faculty website. But I'll find out about that, and then when I send out these materials, I'll tell you what the link is. Okay, so I'll send the link to you. Yeah. I'll show you the link. I'll tell you and show you. Okay. Right. Okay. Good. So we've got so far what we've done is we've talked about what is a thesis and what is an argument. And then we've looked at different lines of argument through the thesis. So we've looked at the argument for the rationale, the argument for the literature review, and the argument for the theory. Right. what we're going to do now is talk about the methodology, the argument for the methodology, and for the thesis as a whole. Right. And then we'll look at some ways of mapping your argument. Okay, and this is something that I've just added. I've done this lines of argument workshop a few times, but I've added in a new aspect which is around developing some diagrams or mapping the argument, which so I'm quite excited about that to share that with you. And then we'll talk a bit about how do you build coherence and cohesion through the thesis as a whole. And then finally we'll talk a bit about the examination process. Okay. And that might be more or less relevant for you depending on where you are. But I think it's always good to know how it works at the end, even if you're at the beginning. Right. So let's talk about the methodology. You need to develop an argument for your methodology to show and tell why your methodology is appropriate to your study. So the lines of argument could be: the methodology is best suited to achieving the purpose of the study and answering the research question. So your methodology has to be able to do that, to be able to achieve the purpose and answer the research questions. But you can also add other kinds of arguments, which is, for example, you might say the methodology is innovative and or it can shed new light on the topic. Okay, so that you could find that you're making a methodological contribution to the scholarship, as well as other kinds of contributions. That doesn't happen in all studies, but if you're using a particular innovative approach to methodology, then that can be part of your contribution to knowledge. Right, and people often don't think about that. They think about, I'm answering my research question and that's the contribution. But you can also be making a methodological contribution if if it's innovative and path-breaking in that way. I had one student who was looking at the let me just remember what it was. He was looking at adolescents, Zulu-speaking adolescents with disabilities, and their understandings of sexuality in relation to HIV and AIDS. It was in KwaZulu-Natal. But he had a methodological interest because he wanted to engage these adolescents as co-researchers, okay, which was quite an unusual type of addition. So he selected three of them and he trained them as co-researchers, and then they went out and conducted interviews and ran focus groups. So he wrote a separate chapter on that in his findings, what he learnt about young people as co-researchers and what their contribution to the study. So that was part of his methodological contribution. And in fact, he had one of his research questions was around what contribution can co-researchers make in the study of sexuality and HIV and AIDS, something like that. So you can even build methodology if you're using innovative and interesting methodology and you're interested to see how it works. That could be even one of your research questions. Okay, that's not very common, but it is possible to think about it like that. Okay. But whatever you decide, you do need to make an argument for your methodology. So that chapter, whether it's chapter 3 or 4, wherever it fits in, you're not just describing the methodology you used, you're also making an argument. You're justifying. So you're saying, it might even be useful to, in your introduction, to say, in this chapter, I argue that. Right. This methodology is appropriate for my study because of this and this and this. Okay. And then you develop that argument through the chapter by showing why it's appropriate. Okay. The methodological argument can also link, or it should link, to the literature, the methodological literature. Right. So your methodology chapter is also a literature review chapter, because you need to situate your discussion in relation to the methodological literature. Okay. So sometimes students forget about that. They think, I finished with the literature now, I'm writing my methodology. But that's also a literature review. chapter. You have to locate your methodology in relation to the appropriate methodological literature. So don't think you finished reading when you finished your literature review chapter. Okay, that's very important. Yes?
Literature in terms of literature on research.
Yes, it could be different kinds of literature. So it could be literature on the paradigm that you're using. Okay, so is your study interpretivist? Are you using critical theory? Are you using constructivism? Is it post-positivist? Whatever the paradigm is. So there's a literature around paradigms. There's a literature around particular approaches. Are you using case study? Are you using mixed methods? Are you using action research? Are you using, what's that other approach? Which one are you using? Content. Okay, content analysis would be part of your data analysis. So so there's literature around approaches. There's also a literature around specific methods like interviewing, focus groups, surveys, observation, and so on.
So you justify your choices.
Yes, based on the situated within that literature. Yes, exactly. And also there's a literature on data analysis, like thematic content analysis, discourse analysis, statistical analysis, narrative analysis, whatever kinds of analysis you're using. You need to look at the literature on that and make an argument for that kind of analysis. Similarly with ethics and trustworthiness or validity, all of that has to be linked to the literature. Yes?
Sounds silly, but it worked for me and maybe it will work for somebody else. But after I've done chapter 1,
yes,
I did my methodology chapter.
Yes.
Because in chapter 1 you only name it, but you have to elaborate in your methodology chapter.
Yes.
And while I'm busy with that, and you start thinking on how and where and what, it helps you how to do your literature review.
Yes.
And your way forward. So that was really easier for me to do it.
Okay, good. Yes, I think that's great. And so you can use the section in your proposal. You have a section on the methodology. You could even just cut and paste that into a separate file, and then you develop that into the methodology chapter. Okay, and each part of it you elaborate and deepen and thicken in with the use of the literature. Yes, Lydia?
Is there a structure that the education department uses, or it depends from me and my supervisor on how we want to structure the chapter?
I think there isn't really a formula for structuring the chapters, but in the methodology you'd need to cover certain aspects. Okay, and usually there is a kind of a broad sequence moving from the bigger to the more specific. Okay, so you'd start typically you start with something like what is the research paradigm, which is the big thing, and then moving down to are you using qualitative or quantitative data or a mixture? What kind of data? People talk about that as a style or orientation. And then the approach. So is it case study? Is it mixed methods, action research, whatever it is? And then the particular sampling that you're using, and then the methods. By methods, I mean how you will gather the data. So interviews, document analysis, observations, concept mapping, whatever you're doing. Okay. And then how you're going to analyze the data, methods of data analysis, thematic content analysis, discourse analysis, statistical analysis, how are you going to do that, right? And then some stuff around the trustworthiness or validity or reliability, depending on the kind of study you're doing, and then stuff around the ethics of the study. So that would be what you'd need to include in that chapter. Exactly how you order it, there's a bit of flexibility around that. Okay. Good. So methodological argument. I find it's quite useful to put in a table in this chapter where you show how your questions are linked to your sources and your methods. And then that helps you to build coherence across the chapter. Right. So in the first column, you've got your question, whatever the question is. And then in the next one, the source, which would be who or what is giving you the information to answer that question. Right. So, for example, say your question is, what are teachers' perceptions regarding formative assessment? Okay. So then the source would be what? Who or what's going to give you information about that? The teachers. Right. So the source would be the teachers, and then the method of data collection. How would you get that information from them? It could be interviews, interviews or focus groups, or maybe you'd get them to write a journal or whatever, right? So that would be the method of data collection. And then the method of data analysis would be how you analyze that data. So that could be thematic content analysis, or it could be discourse analysis, or whatever it is. Okay, but it would probably qualitative data, because you're finding out about their perceptions. Okay, so do you see how, if you align your questions with your sources and your methods, then it helps you to understand what the line of argument is. Because you're saying then, my methods are appropriate because they'll help me to answer the question, and therefore that'll help me to achieve the purpose of my research. Okay, so that table, I find that table is quite a useful thing.
Is this something that you would include in your actual study, or is it just for yourself?
I think it's useful to actually include it, even in your proposal, but certainly in your methodology chapter. Right. And it's a good idea to do that once you've discussed your sources and your methods and your methods of data collection, of analysis, and then you have this summary table which pulls everything together. And then the examiner can see, oh, you've thought about it. You've thought about how you're linking all of these things, and that helps you to strengthen your argument and show what you're telling about your argument. Okay. Right. Do you get that difference between sources and methods? I think that's an important distinction. So the source is who or what is giving you the information, and the method is how you're going to collect the information or analyze it. Okay, so don't confuse those two things. Sure.
Document analysis.
Yes.
That's recently. Isn't it also you interpret the statistical evidence? That it's in one way quantitative, and the other way also qualitative.
It could be. Document analysis could be qualitative or quantitative. Yeah. So it depends on how you do the analysis. So I was marking a thesis where the student was analyzing a curriculum, and so on the one hand she was doing a qualitative analysis by looking at the language used and what it meant. And then on the other hand, she was doing a quantitative analysis by counting the kinds of verbs that were used. And then she combined those two. So it can be, but you have to have good reasons for doing that. Okay.
So you have to have a reason why you do that.
Yes, that's right. So you always have to justify your, all your methodological choices have to have reasons. And that's where the argument comes in. Right? So argument is about a sequence of reasons that you're building in. So it's not enough just to say, I'm using document analysis. You have to say, why are you using that? And how are you using it? And what are your reasons for using it in that way? That's all part of your argument for the methodology. So a typical problem with a thesis would be there's not enough justification of the methodological choices that you're making. And so that's what when I'm looking at what I expect from a good thesis is a strong motivation for methodological choices that are made. And that's part of the argument for the methodology. Yeah? Honey?
I'm just
I'm just wondering that table there.
Yes.
So if you have experiments and you have a workbook at the end of the experiment,
Yes.
the source be the workbook and the method would be then from that workbook you want both quantitative and qualitative. Or would it still be the participant that's the source and the workbook would be the...
Yeah, no, I think the workbook, who or what is giving you the information, it would be the workbook. Eh? Yeah, that would be the source, and then you'd be doing document analysis on that workbook, which might be quantitative and or qualitative for the following reasons. Okay. Right. Yes?
Looking specifically at people's interpretation
Yes.
of the content of that workbook or documents.
Yes. Then, yes.
Then that would not be used as in a quantitative.
No, so that would be a qualitative analysis. Okay, so you'd probably get that from doing some kind of thematic content analysis of the workbooks, something like that. Okay, I know that sometimes workbooks are useful for seeing, for example, how do the learners work out the solution to, say, a maths problem. So you're interested in looking at the process of their thinking, and then you'd analyze that in terms of processes or sequences of reasoning, something like that. So that would be a qualitative analysis. Okay, so you're getting the idea, eh? Right, good. I just want to show you an example. So here's an example of one of my PhD students who was looking at she was doing medical focused research on newly qualified doctors. So there'd been quite a lot of research about medical students and curriculum and stuff, but people hadn't looked much at what happens with newly qualified doctors once they're out there and they're learning. So this is what her argument around the methodology. In the medical education literature overall, there's a noticeable lack of research reported on holistic experiences of newly qualified doctors. There have been attempts to measure various competencies or skills, sometimes even to compare graduates of problem-based learning curricula with graduates of traditional curricula. However, a predominance of positivist methods in the field of medical education has rarely allowed participants the necessary freedom and or opportunity to reflect on and describe their experiences in a holistic way. More research employing reflexive methodology is needed to establish a deeper understanding of how curricular innovations impact on workplace learning that takes place during internships. So do you see how she's developing an argument for her methodological choices by looking at the methodological literature? So what is she saying about the existing literature there? Sorry, it's quite a mouthful, and I know it's a medical context, but what is she saying about the dominant type of way that research is done? It's positivist, eh? Right, so it's within a positivist paradigm, and it's mainly measuring things, eh? It's like measuring competencies and that kind of stuff. So she's saying that's the existing type of methodological approach. So what is she bringing in? What is the gap? Yeah, it's more qualitative, eh? Getting people to reflect on their experiences. That hasn't been done much. So she's bringing in that. That's her methodological contribution. Okay, by using ways to establish a deeper understanding of how curricular innovation impacts on workplace learning, to reflect and describe their experiences in a holistic way. Right, so what kind of methods do you think she would use to do that? Yeah, interviews. So she used in-depth interviews, and she interviewed them twice at different times, kind of longitudinal methodology. Focus groups could be, yeah. She didn't actually do that because they were dispersed, as newly qualified doctors. They were all over the place. But that would be a good way of doing it, just to get them together and talk about it, and you might get some interesting interactions between them, which would highlight some of their learning and experiences. Okay. Can you think of any other methods that would be appropriate for this kind of study, besides interviews and focus groups? A survey? A survey is typically good for getting a broad cross-section of people, but it won't necessarily give you the depth of information. Okay. So she's trying to get them to reflect on and describe their experiences in a holistic way. So a survey probably wouldn't get that depth. Yeah. A questionnaire might. Journal, yeah. Journal or diaries. So getting them to write reflective journals, that would also be a really useful way to do it.
I'm thinking if they are too far apart,
Yes.
she wants to do it over different provinces,
Yes.
reach everybody by giving them a questionnaire.
Yes. So, sometimes people would send out a survey and then follow it up with an in-depth interview, and then perhaps pull out some of the issues or themes that come out of the questionnaire, and then talk about them in more depth. So that could be a way of doing it. Right. So you're starting to think methodologically, which is great. So you're thinking about what is she trying to achieve, what's the best methods for achieving that, how would she go about doing that, and that's all part of the thinking methodologically. Okay. So that's just one example. Yeah. So what I want you to do is just, and maybe you've already done it, but just note down what's your argument for your methodological choices. Okay. So that would mean, what methodology are you using, and why is that appropriate for your particular study? Okay. So jot down some points there, and then we'll have a chance to talk about that. Right. So if I can just stop you there, you've had a chance to think about your methodological argument. Would anyone like to try out that? Just give us what is your argument for your methodology? Would anyone like to pose that for us? To try it out? No one? Okay, because sometimes it helps you to articulate it, and which is what you've been doing, right, with each other. Perhaps, Carmelita, do you mind if I ask you again, because you're at the end of the process, and just so we can hear how someone's doing it, who's thought through the whole thesis, right?
So I am focusing on single mother families, and so I chose a multiple case study design, and each family constitutes a case. Why I chose case study design? Because case study design allows for multiple sources of information. And so within my case, I looked at perspective of the mother and the adolescent and my own observations as well. And then I used interviews and focus group to gather those sources of information.
Okay, very nice. So you're using a case study design, and it's a multiple case study design. The unit of analysis is the family, or another word for unit of analysis is the case. So you've got several cases. How many families did you have?
6 families.
6 families.
I understood the unit of analysis as in what I'm looking for, and I'm looking at perceptions of educational support.
Yes.
And so that was my unit of analysis.
Okay.
How do they experience support, or what are the ways of support? And that was my unit of analysis in each case.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, in the case study literature, people would say the unit of analysis and the case is the same thing. So it just depends on. There could be some variation in the literature. So as long as you define it clearly and you can back it up from the literature, I think there could be more than one way of understanding it. But what I would call that is the focus of the case. So the focus of the case is the family. The focus of the case would be what you were saying about the forms of support within that family. Okay. And then you're deciding to choose a case study design. First of all, because you've got a number of different families, but also because you want to collect, you've got multiple data collection methods. So you're using interviews and observations, and then you also have multiple sources of data. So it's the mother, was it the adolescent, and your own observations. Right. So case study design is good for multiple methods and multiple sources. And how did you analyze the data? Thematic content analysis. Okay, great. So I think that makes a kind of coherent argument for using a case study design. You could also refer to, if you found other similar studies that have looked at families or single parent families, and did you find any that were using case study? Or?
I can't think of specific ones now.
Yes, but that could also be a possible line of argument. You could say that in investigating this particular topic, other people have used a similar methodology for these reasons, and then that could also support your argument for using that.
Thinking of others, they have also focused on one perspective, so only the mother.
Okay.
The adolescent.
Yes.
And so because I wanted to include both,
yes,
the case study was approved.
Okay, great. So that's also how you're adding, in a way, you're adding something new to the methodological scholarship, because you're not just focusing on one source, but combining different perspectives. So it's almost multi-perspectival, within the case study design. Great. Thank you. So you see how Carmelita was developing the argument for the methodology by thinking about what does she want to find out, what are her questions, and then what design or methods will suit that and help her to answer or achieve that question, that purpose. Okay, great. So I think, as I was saying, the methodology, often this line of argument is a bit neglected, because people just think, the methodology chapter, you just have to describe your methodology. But it's more than that. You have to present an argument to justify your methodology and link it to your study and show and argue for how it's appropriate for answering your main research question and achieving the purpose of your study. Okay.
Having the opportunity of going to conferences, I've always sat there and actually listened to Professor ask, but why did you use this method? Even when someone finished presenting the paper, was it not clear? But now I think actually even when you present the paper, it actually needs to be clear.
Yes.
As to actually to fulfill all those different facets.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important. And quite often there are different options within a methodology. You could do it in different ways. So you might have a research question. You could do a case study. You could do a narrative research. You could even do action research. So you have to kind of work out what are the options? Why should I choose this one rather than that one? And sometimes the reasons are more practical, like logistical or whatever. So you just have to think through it and make sure you've got good reasons and you can explain them clearly. Right. So let's move on now. The final one is the thesis argument. So this is the big arrow, and it's what are you claiming from your thesis in relation to your research question or problem. So this is like the bottom line. I've done this research, and this is what I found. I found that, say, if we're thinking about the study we were talking about, is it JP? JP was interested in teachers' perspectives on formative assessment in maths education. So maybe JP goes and collects all the data, and he finds that teachers don't understand formative assessment, and they confuse it with summative assessment, something like that. Right. So that's the claim you're making, and that's in response to your research problem or question, which is what are teachers' perspectives on formative assessment in maths education, or something like that. Okay, so the thesis argument is your bottom line in a way, and you should be able to summarize that in just 1 or 2 sentences. It's what's coming out of the research. Okay, your overall claim, right? And that line that could confirm or extend or contest existing scholarship, right? So you might it's useful to link that overall claim to the scholarship again. So you're saying that my findings are significant because they're confirming what other people have found out, or it's significant because it is showing something different. Right? Other studies found this, but I'm finding that. Right? So those could be the kinds of lines of argument. And you are making an empirical or methodological or theoretical contribution. Okay. So when you in this thesis argument, you need to think about the kind of contribution you're making to the scholarship. Right. So you can see there that diagram tries to show the relation between those different lines of argument. The thesis argument is the big one, but you can see how it's built on the other ones. So it's built on the rationale, the literature review, the theory and methodology arguments. All of those would contribute to giving a strong foundation for your thesis argument. Okay? If you haven't got a good rationale, then it weakens the thesis argument. The same with the literature, methodology, and theory. Okay, so it's good to think about it together. Right. As I said, I've added in some idea of trying to map your argument, developing a diagram for your argument. So it might look something like this. You start with your main research question or problem. Okay, so that's you put that at the bottom or at the top, wherever you want to put it, and then your main conclusion. So that would be the bottom line that you've developed. Right? So say JP's main. Okay, if I'm twisting your study, but say your main research problem or question was, can you just formulate it yourself?
Learning how teachers can redesign classroom-based assessments towards mathematical proficiency.
Okay, right. So how can teachers redesign classroom-based assessment for mathematical proficiency? That's the problem or the question that you're trying to answer. And then your main conclusion, okay, I know you're still busy, but your main conclusion would be, they don't know how to do that, or they can do that, but this and this is the problem, or something like that. Okay.
So, like you said, formative assessment is used as summative assessment.
Okay. So maybe let's say your main conclusion is that teachers struggle to redesign assessment because of a confusion between formative and summative assessment, which has some problems for mathematical proficiency or something like that. So that's your main conclusion. Right. So do you see how the main conclusion has to address the problem? That's very important. So you must make sure you're answering your own question. I mean, it seems an obvious thing, but you can't, and it's not so obvious because sometimes you find that a student starts to answer other questions as they're going through the research. They find some other interesting thing, and then you find out they end with a question that wasn't there in the beginning. Okay. Now that's, you might find that you do find answers to other questions, but you need to recognize that then. And your findings might say, in addition to answering these questions, another significant finding was this. And so there might be unexpected or unanticipated findings that are not directly answering your research questions. You can include that as long as you acknowledge clearly this is something else. Because sometimes research does generate unexpected outcomes, which can be very valuable. Right. But your main claim must address your problem or question. Right. But that's not enough for your thesis argument. It's not just enough to say, this is what I found, and it's answering this question. You need to clarify the premises. So those are the propositions that are founding your claims. Okay. So say, for example, if we go back to JP's research, he's finding that the teachers perhaps confuse formative and summative assessment, and which affects their redesign of the assessment. Right. So what are the premises? It might be that teachers don't understand what formative assessment is. Right. So it's the smaller blocks that make up the bigger argument. And another one might be teachers design assessment based on summative assessment principles, something like that. Okay. So you see how those premises would then feed into the conclusion. Right.
Can I ask what is premises in Afrikaans?
I have no idea. No idea. Inleidende argument, yeah. I think, so it would be the argument that leads to the bigger argument. So they're like smaller arguments that lead to the bigger argument. Another English word is proposition. I don't know if... What would be the Afrikaans word for that?
It's like the same as in a debate. You have a proposition.
Yes. Onderwerp. Yeah. So that's like, yeah. So it's... Okay, right. Okay, so you get the idea, eh? So it's like you've got the big claim, and the premises are the underlying sub-claims or assumptions that lead to that bigger claim. Okay, so you have to show that, your proposition that supports the argument.
Might that be your aims, objectives, or things like that?
No, it's not this. The aims and objectives would be linked to your main research question. Okay, but this is about the findings. Right? So it's the big finding and the smaller findings that back up the bigger finding. Okay, so there's a clear logic to the development of your argument, and then it's not enough just to have the premises. You need to have the evidence that shows that. Okay, so there must be evidence that supports those premises. Material that supports the premise, and that could be things like facts, examples, statistics, literature. So that's what's coming out of your data to support your argument. Okay. So together, that's making up your line of argument for your thesis. Right. So you're making this main conclusion. That teachers confuse they confuse summative and formative assessment. Right. On what basis? Right. Then that goes back to the premises. Teachers don't understand what formative assessment is. Teachers design based on summative assessment premises. Right. On what basis is that? Well, the basis is that in the interviews they told me assessment is summative. That's how they understand it. And then when I looked at their designs, so I observed or I analyzed the actual design, I could see that it was based on summative assessment principles. So you see that's the evidence that's backing up your premises. Right, so do you see how you have these different components of the argument? They have to fit together and support each other. Right. So that's why developing a diagram can be quite useful, because it helps you to identify the different components of the argument and to think about how they relate to each other. I'm going to, I've got a list of resources which I'll send to you. There's one which shows this, it's on the Thesis Whisperer. It's a blog site. Have you heard of it? It's a really nice blog site. And there's one article on constructing an argument or something, structuring an argument, and it gives a number of diagrams to show how you can develop this. Let me just show you an example. So here, so the problem is why adults perform poorly in numeracy and math. So, in adult education, this is a kind of perennial problem, is that in maths and numeracy, adult learners often struggle, right? So you might say that's the research problem, or the question would be, why do adult learners struggle with maths and numeracy? Right. So that's where you're starting. And then you might have found that adult learners have negative attitudes. So they struggle because they've got negative attitudes. Right. But then on what basis can you say they've got negative attitudes? Right. So then that would be the premises. They have a fear of failure, and there's poor teaching in maths. Right. But on what basis do you say that? Well, I've interviewed them, and many of them talk about how they don't like maths, they struggle, they feel anxious about it, and that relates to their previous experience when it's primary school, when they got it wrong, they got beaten, and so they always feared numbers. And then poor teaching, you might say, well, on what basis do you know that? I've observed some classes and blah, 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 blah. You see what I mean? So that you've got the evidence, the premises leading to the main conclusion, which is answering your main question or problem. Okay. And so that's just one example of a diagram, but the diagrams might look different depending on your particular argument. So you might have several different premises, or you might have premises that link to each other, building up to the conclusion. So you develop a diagram that kind of fits with your particular argument. Okay, but that can be quite a useful way of doing it, I think, because it forces you to think through the argument, and then you kind of work out, well, do my premises lead to my conclusion? If they don't, then there's something wrong with the logic of the argument. Okay, and then you might adapt it and switch it around a bit. Because one of the things that examiners look for is the rigor of the research, which includes, is the argument coherent? Does the conclusion follow from the premises, and is it based on evidence? Okay. So if you're making claims and you haven't got the evidence to support the claim, then there's something wrong with the thesis. Okay, so this helps you with that kind of issue. Okay. Right. So I'm just wondering if you think about what I'd like you to I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to think about. If you take one of your lines of argument, okay, we had those 5, eh? So the rationale, the literature review, the theory, the methodology, and then the overall findings. If you're doing your proposal, you're probably thinking about the rationale and methodology, that area. If you finished your thesis, then you'll be thinking about the big argument, right? So what I'd like you to do is just on the back of the sheet that I handed you, see if you can develop a little diagram for one of those arguments. Okay. Right. So say for example it's your rationale. Then you might have an overall rationale, and then maybe a few different premises. One based on the literature, one based on experience, or whatever. So I'm just going to give you time to play with that. A few minutes, 5 minutes to play with that, just to see if you can think about how to diagramize an argument. Okay. And let's see what comes out of that. Kinds of diagrams. So you've recontextualized this into your own study, which I think that's great, because each diagram must look different because your studies are different. And also I think that people think visually in different ways. Some of you are doing your diagrams that way, so more like a linear one. Others were doing it more holistically. So it depends on your own way of thinking and your own study. But that's I find this quite useful. And you might even consider, I think it might be useful to even include a diagram like this in your last chapter, your findings chapters, because it's a nice way of summarizing not only the findings but the argument. Right. So it might be a planning tool, or you might also use it as a summary tool. Okay. But I just wanted to show you this. I'm just moving away now. So we've talked about arguments, right? So I think we finished that part of it. This is a diagram that comes from a book by Trafford and Lesham, which is called Stepping Stones Towards Your Doctorate or something like that. I find it's a really useful book because it kind of takes you through the whole process. And I found this diagram particularly useful. It's called the magic circle. And it kind of shows how the different parts of the thesis are linked. Right. So if you have a look, you see you're starting with the research issue. So that's like the research problem or the main question. Right. Or it's bigger than that. So you might say the issues around mathematics assessment, if we just look at your example. And then and that comes from the gap in the scholarship, you see? And then from that you develop a research statement, and then a research question, and then that can lead to a conceptual framework. And then your research design, which is how are you going to find out about that? How are you going to get the information? And then that links to field work, which is actually going out and getting the stuff. So you see there's a kind of a circle there. The research design, which guides your field work, which then refers back to the research design and continues like that. And then once you finish that, then you've got different kinds of conclusions. Right. They talk about factual conclusions. So that would be the empirical evidence that you've been gathering, what you find out about that. Interpretive conclusions, so how you make sense of that empirical data, right? How you interpret it. And then conceptual conclusions would be more, what does it mean for theory or the concepts? How does it relate to the existing theory? Does it generate, does it confirm the theory? Does it generate new ideas? Yeah, so, and then that links to the contribution to knowledge. So those various kinds of findings would be what you are contributing to the knowledge. Okay. And then that, again, that's addressing the research issue. So do you see how all of these things are linked as well? The conclusions are linked to the research statement, the question, and the conceptual framework. So there's those kind of cross-cutting links as well. So I think this is a useful model because it helps you to build the coherence of the thesis by connecting the different parts of it, right? Not seeing them as separate silos. Sometimes you think about chapters as almost like silos, but this is a way of thinking across the chapters. And the thesis is something that encompasses the whole thing. Okay, so this is something that it's useful just to have in your mind as you're doing it, so you don't make the mistake of thinking in silos. Okay, one of the limitations of a thesis is we write in chapters in a linear way. I mean that's just part of the convention, but that we have to think across those chapters. And the argument is something that flows right through. Yeah. So this kind of a holistic diagram which shows the interactions and interconnections is useful from that point of view. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Right. Good. Yeah. And so then these are just some of the resources. Quite a variety of resources there. You see that Trafford and Lesham book is at the bottom there. Stepping Stones in Achieving Your Doctorate. So even if you're doing a master's, that's a useful book because it goes through the process, right? And of course, the doctorate's at a different level and a different scale, but it's the same basic components. And then I've got some stuff from blogs, Clarence there, and the Thesis Whisperer. That's a useful blog which has got lots of ideas about writing a thesis. And you can, if you get into the blog, it's got lists of topics and very interesting, accessible and short articles on different aspects of the thesis. So it's very useful if you're struggling with something, you just want to get a some quick ideas about it. You don't want to read a whole book about it, or you want to find a way to get into the topic. That's very useful for it. And then Maninen, that's a YouTube thing about constructing an argument, which is also very useful. I found. Okay, so you can take that further yourselves, and then just to investigate it. And the first one, Adams and Bluto, that's a journal article around the place of theory. So that section on theory, it looks at different kinds of theory and the relation between them in relation to your study. So have a look at that if you're interested in that. Okay. Right. So we've got a little bit of time left. I just wanted to talk about the examination, because I think some of you are close to the examination, and even if you still with your proposal, I think it's useful just to know about the procedure. For the proposal, you present your proposal to, depending on which department you're in, a committee will look at your proposal. Okay, so who's in curriculum studies? Okay, so in curriculum studies, there's a curriculum studies proposal committee that meets about four times a year. So there's a meeting coming up in November. Right, I can't remember is it the 10th of November? Something like that. No, I don't know I can't remember the date, but it's early in November. It's about the 6th of November. Right. So you have to submit your proposal a week before, and then the proposal is assigned to committee members who've got some knowledge of your topic or your methodology, and then you attend the meeting and present your proposal, and then the committee members will have looked at your proposal, and then they ask you questions and have some comments, and then they make a decision about the proposal. In adult and higher education, we've got our own committee within the center, so it goes through that committee. So then, and it's the same with the PhD. It would go through a committee, and then you get feedback. Either it's accepted, or you have to do some small corrections to your supervisor's satisfaction, or you need to resubmit it, and the committee looks at it again. Okay, so that's how the proposal works. Some of you've been through that process there. Some of you are still preparing for that. I think it's a really good process because it gives you a chance to get feedback beyond your supervisor. Quite often, you're working very closely with your supervisor, but that committee has other people with other perspectives and other expertise. So it's very useful to hear what they have to say and get their views. I know it's a bit traumatic because you're suddenly faced with all these academics, but it is a really good opportunity to get feedback. So I think it's good to see it like that, and that feedback will eventually strengthen your thesis and also give you context, because you might want to follow up a discussion, and you can go and talk to anyone about your thesis. You don't have to just talk to your supervisor. Right? So that's the proposal, right? And then the examination. It's a bit difficult for the PhD, different from PhD and the masters. The masters, I think you have 2 examiners. Is that right? I can't remember because I'm from UKZN, so I'm just learning the system. You have an internal and an external, or sometimes if there's not an internal, there's 2 externals. They examine your thesis independently, and then they send in their reports, and then there's a chairperson who looks at the reports and makes a recommendation about what the result should be. If the reports are similar, then they often just kind of take an average, but if there's a wide discrepancy, then sometimes they'll bring in another examiner or someone to arbitrate between those. Right? And then it goes through that process, and then once it's concluded, the report, it goes back to your supervisor, and then the supervisor shares that with you as the student. Right, so that's the master's. Then the PhD, you have 3 examiners. Right? So it's you have more examining, and then typically it's an internal examiner, and then external, national, and there's usually an international examiner. Right. So it's the same thing happens. Each of them examines the thesis independently. They don't know each other, and they produce their report, send it in, and then there's someone called a non-examining chair who then has a look at those reports, and then there's a viva voce. So it's where you present your thesis, and the examiners ask you questions and give you comments. But you will have seen the reports before you present and been able to discuss them with your supervisor and respond to them. Okay. And then the same thing after that, they make a decision, and it could be one of those decisions, accept it with some corrections to the supervisor's satisfaction, or revise it and resubmit it to one or more of the examiners. Right. So those are the kind of outcomes. Okay. Yes.
And the article, because I submitted my article now, I think I have 3 and then now 2 reviewers. I don't know who they are, and now I'm submitting for the last time for the first publication.
Okay.
And then these 2 now to other publications you also must go through. And I'm also going to be at the end.
Yes.
Going through the whole other process.
Yes, you will go through that process, because your thesis would put the articles together, and you'd have some kind of introduction and conclusion, or perhaps methodology or whatever. So the articles are almost like chapters, and they do go through an independent review process, which is great because it'll strengthen it, because you get additional feedback. But you will also have to go through that process where you're presenting the thesis as a whole, and it's examined by examiners, and then you have the same process of a viva voce. So, yeah. Yes?
Do you do the presentation via a PowerPoint, or is it up to you how you want to present it?
It's really up to you, but it's a good idea to have some kind of presentation. So the ones that I've been to, people have used PowerPoint, and what they do then is they just perhaps summarize the thesis quite briefly, and then try and address some of the key issues arising from the examiner's reports. Okay, so that just shows the examiners you've thought about the issues, and this is what you've done in response to those issues. Okay, so a PowerPoint's a good idea, but not long. You haven't got very long, so maybe say 20 minutes or so. Yeah. Any other questions about the examination process? Okay. Again, I think that the whole idea is to make it a constructive process. So the idea is it's part of your own development as a student. So of course there is an evaluative component, but I think within our faculty people are interested in supporting and developing the student. So even though it is a pressurized situation, I think the examiners have the interests of the students at heart generally. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think we've got one last session in November. What we'll do is, and that session focuses on going forward with your thesis and your academic pursuits. We'll send out the notice and see what the response is like, because it's towards the end of November and we're not quite sure people's availability and so on. But we've got Professor van der Walt and Professor Frick who will run that session. So I think it'll be a great session. So we'll just see what comes out of that one. And then so that'll be the final one. Okay. Right. So perhaps just to conclude, any thoughts on this particular session that because we've been through a lot if you think about what we've done today. Lines of argument through the rationale, the literature review, methodology, theory, and the thesis as a whole. And then we also talked a bit about the coherence of the thesis and how to link things. And then we talked a bit about the examination. Right. So any thoughts about what have you got from this session, or what questions or problems do you still worrying you?
When I came submitted everything, but I'm not writing yet. I mean, I sort of like see why I really write it, because it's a matter of the theoretical framework and the literature.
Okay.
And you have all this information, you get all these things, but it's like, how do I get all this information? Then actually having to sort of interrogate this literature. All of them are useful, but I think we need to actually get all.
Yes. Yes.
That's why actually.
Okay, good, thanks. So you found that the sections on the literature review and the theoretical framework helped you in relation to where you are at the moment in the progress of your thesis. Good, thank you. Any other? Yes. Yes. Sorry.
Actually, to me, because I'm so far ahead, actually, to me, I've started thinking, do I have the golden thread clearly?
Yes.
It's there, but by checking the arguments again in all the different sections, because I don't know if it's really so clear, so it really helps me now to go and make sure of that, especially your diagrams. That is a great help.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Also realized that your planning is it's such a crucial part. I think often I find myself very hasty to start. You're excited about what you want to write, but I think you actually save yourself a lot of time and effort if you can kind of pause and thoroughly plan your argument and understand your argument before you start writing up.
Yeah.
I realize that's so important.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful way of using some of these tools as a planning tool. And it doesn't mean you can't change it, because sometimes you'll find that as you're writing it, you adapt it or shift it a little bit because it's not working as you envisage. But it gives you a starting point and a guideline. So I think that's good. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, yeah.
William can give some examples of a PhD with article 4.
I can find out for you, because some of my colleagues have supervised that kind of PhD. Okay, will you just send me an email?
I'll send you.
Okay, and then I'll find out, and then I can refer you to.
Because I find there is not much done on it. If I look for something,
yes.
I can't really find it.
Yes. Oh, okay, great. So I'll send you maybe a list of ones that have been done, and then I think there is some literature on it that my colleagues an expert, Professor Frick. So just send me an email and I'll speak to her and I'll let you know.
Is your email on that one that we always get from?
It might not be, I can't remember, but it's P Rule 2015. P Rule, Prule 2015 at sun.ac.za. Right. So if you just send it to me on Monday, I'll make sure I respond.
But if you look in the repository of Stellenbosch University, the e-thesis,
right.
I know like at the Sustainability Institute, they encourage that article writing thesis.
Okay.
So I know of masters and I think it's 1 or 2 PhDs.
Okay, so the Sustainability Institute would have examples of that. Great. Okay, good. Thank you. Any other? Yeah?
I just want to thank you. I always just thought the thesis is like right to the end. You just build it up and there's your argument and,
Right. Yeah.
But keep on making the strong argument throughout and bringing it back. I mean, you tried to bring it back, but I think you've done a brilliant job of just making sure, just get to the bottom line. What is it exactly that you're saying? You know, just not after 40 pages, I think this is what I've said.
Yes. Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. So I'm glad that you've got a sense of that. Okay. Right, so it's really up to you to go and do it now, and or redo it, or wherever you are. And right, so have a good weekend, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.